Welcome to Literary Analysis Essay Body Paragraphs with Mrs. T. This video assumes you already have some brainstorming or outlining work done and know where you are going with your paper. If you need help with those steps, please see my other videos about those topics for some tips. Today we will go over literary analysis body paragraphs and I'll share some examples with you. These examples are a continuation of the example from my video on introduction paragraphs, where I include an example based off the short story Clack the Rattlebag by Neil Gaiman. This is my newer video series, and my older video series uses an example from To Kill a Mockingbird. Much of the information is the same in both videos. The writing pause points are in this video and are intended for those typing their paper or writing live so that you have a place to pause and work on your writing yourself.
These are our goals today. We want to see if we can write the first draft of your body paragraphs, see if you can properly cite those examples in your text, and also introduce those examples with some good context. All right, before we get started, let's do a quick review of a basic essay format. First of all, there's the introduction paragraph. If you want more details on what goes into an introduction, please see my video on introduction paragraphs. Introductions, the basics, they have a hook, a tension getter to get your reader interested in your topic. They have background information to establish the context of your topic and what you're going to say about it, which finally leads us to your main point, which is your thesis. In today's video, we're doing body paragraphs. We will usually have multiple body paragraphs. Please check with your instructor to know how many body paragraphs they require, but just know that I tend to tell my students that you need enough body paragraphs to prove your point and show that you've analyzed the entire body of the piece of literature you've been asked to analyze. Some of you may know some other acronyms that are helpful in thinking about body paragraphs. Lots of teachers use different acronyms or tricks to teach you these concepts. One of the ones I hear a lot from students who've taken history courses is the SIR paragraph. This is often used in argument, but if you think about it, literary analysis really is an argument. It's an argument about a piece of literature and your interpretation of it. So it does kind of cross over. SIR stands for claim, evidence, and reasoning. However, I think that acronym kind of leaves a little bit more on the table that we should really address. So you'll see that I have lots of other components added to that acronym in my body paragraph parts. The other one you'll tend to see is just an abbreviation of the parts that I have, which is TS, CD, and COM. You'll have a lot of teachers tell you need one sentence of topic sentence, one sentence concrete detail, and 2 sentences of commentary. Me personally, I tell students that if they really need a minimum number of sentences, but as you develop as a writer, you really should not be locked into that there's a certain number that you need in order to be sufficient in your writing. There's many sophisticated writers who are able to combine sentences and say something in one sentence that somebody else might need 2 or 3 sentences to say. So I don't like students to get locked into this idea of I need X number of sentences, because that can often hamper your writing ability and really your style. So for me, a body paragraph has some main components. We usually have a topic sentence that establishes what that paragraph is going to prove about the main idea. So it is a breakdown of the thesis. We also have concrete details. Those are evidence or examples or other words for those. They may be quotations, summary, paraphrasing. You may have a teacher that tells you you need to have a certain number of examples and also tell you how many of those need to be direct quotations from your text. That's all teacher discretion. A lot of that is trying to get you to be as specific as possible while also picking the most relevant information to include in your analysis. It also helps make sure that you're not just depending on a bunch of summary. Summary, the danger with that is that you can often get into where you are too general, vague, or you simply misinterpret what was going on in the scene. Quotations are pretty concrete. That's why we call them concrete details. We can look at them. We can point at them in the book. We can talk about how we interpret them and argue about that, but we can't argue what the author wrote. We know what they wrote. It's there on the page. Quotations should be used whenever applicable, and I usually tell my students to use a combination of quotations and paraphrase. Then we have commentary. That's your explanation. It's your connection to your main idea. This is the largest portion of the essay. That's why a lot of teachers will tell you to have at least 2 sentences of commentary for every single piece of evidence. You're going to notice in my examples later in this presentation that commentary is the biggest section every single time and is usually numerous paragraphs because there's a few things we need to do when we write commentary. Finally, you transition to the next body paragraph. This gives a sense of closure and also tells us where we're going. Some students struggle with this one quite a bit, and some students don't do it at all because they end up doing the transition actually in the topic sentence of the next paragraph. I always tell my students it's kind of up to them, but you really want to pick one or the other for every paragraph, that you either want to close out the previous one or you want to start to explain how this idea is transitioning to the next. And then the last part of the essay is the conclusion paragraph. Honestly, in high school, this is the thing I struggled with the most with my teachers. For some reason, I just did not get it. I did not understand it. So I have a separate video all about conclusions, and I keep it pretty simple so that you can at least get the basics and leave your readers with a sense of closure.
Last reminder, I have an older similar video that covers the same information for an essay about To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This video uses an essay example about Neil Gaiman's Clack the Rattlebag.
Before watching this video, you should have already organized how you want to write your body paragraphs. If you didn't, then you probably should go get some resources to help you out with that. You might see some of my resources or see if your teacher has any that you can use. Did they have you write an outline? Did they have you do any type of pre-writing, any brainstorming? Use those before you jump into writing your body paragraphs. If you try to wing it, it's probably going to feel like you wing it, or you're going to have to spend a lot of time digging back through a text or revising. So do you really want to have to do that? Do you want a disjointed paper that doesn't have a line of reasoning? That's where the writing process helps out. Outlining, brainstorming, pre-writing really helps to make sure you have solid ideas and a solid foundation.
Just to remind you, this is the thesis statement I am working with for the body paragraphs in this video. Pause and read it if you need to. Remember, everything in the essay will point back to proving and supporting this thesis. I've also underlined key terms and literary devices to keep in mind as we work on topic sentences in the rest of the essay. I will want to consider synonymous terms for these ideas and words as I continue writing. All right, so first, note this example of a topic sentence. Go ahead and pause and read it if you need to. I've underlined key phrases and words in mind. Don't do this in your own topic sentence. I just want you to notice what I've done. I'll also notice that my statement is actually 2 sentences long because the first sentence sets the foundation of the setting, tone, and descriptions working together, but then the second sentence relates it to the larger thematic idea. I'm doing a lot here, so yours may be a little simpler than mine. Just remember that you need to focus on what this paragraph is setting out to prove from your argument. Also keep in mind that I'm following a format that focuses on a writing or multiple writing techniques for each body paragraph. But I also kept in mind the chronological order as I decided on which writing choices I should write about first. It makes sense for me to begin with the writing choices that lay the foundation for the whole story. Recall that my thesis is about how we can get tricked or manipulated by people who appear as someone or something they're not. This is shown through the author's story and choices in the way he wrote it. So this sentence establishes this paragraph will cover how he creates a modern Gothic setting through descriptions and contrasts, which then create a mysterious tone. I then also tie this to the main idea of this concept of an illusion of innocence, which is what my thesis is about.
So now that we have a topic sentence that's solid and we know what we're going to talk about in that paragraph, it's time to embed some examples. However, we need to remember some things before we jump into that. Context matters with examples. Too often I see students plopping in quotations because they're required by the teacher, but then the writing just doesn't make a whole lot of sense and it's incredibly formulaic and it feels very forced. So, one way to fix this is to build context. Now, it depends on what you're analyzing. If you're analyzing a story, novel, or play, you need to think of what scene is it from? What was going on? Who was involved? What is the circumstance? Are you analyzing a poem? Well, then which stanza are we talking about? What is the poet writing about in that portion? The next thing you need to remember is to only quote the most important part of the text. You don't need to include the whole sentence. You can use part of it, that's okay, but you still need to have that context to set up an incomplete sentence. And also make sure the flow works. If you're analyzing a simile, then quote the simile and put the rest in your own words. If you're analyzing harsh diction used to describe a character's mannerisms, then only quote those harsh words and paraphrase the rest. If you don't know how to properly parenthetically cite examples, please see my other video on literary analysis evidence. This is the beginning and basic level of setting up evidence, these techniques here that you see. Please note that this type of writing is not always the best, but it is a starting point towards more fluid writing. So let's look at it. First, I write some context. Now, you don't have to do this as a separate sentence, but this example kind of does that. I set up which part of the story I'm bringing up in my example and what it's about. So I say, at the beginning of the story, the narrator and the boy give descriptions of the house. My reader now expects me to give both examples, which I do. However, note that there's a lot of quotation given and it's pretty formulaic. And it's kind of short and choppy. However, you also notice that I include more introductory information by adding who said or provided each description in the story. The first example is written as the boy says is a very big house and lots of times the lights don't work and it's a sort of dark. Then it goes into the second quotation, which says the narrator says we were in the kitchen where it was light and warm. While writing like this may be a bit too wordy and not very fluid, it does show the ability to consider context and help the reader understand where you're going. Again, this is kind of a beginning writer. Some of you may be at this stage, but don't worry. In the next slides, I'll show you how to elevate this and sound more like a sophisticated writer. Did you know that you can actually include several pieces of evidence in one sentence? But there are some tricks to doing this. First, you need to make sure that what the evidence is about, they have something in common. So that's typically the context, function, or writing choice that's going on. Here is my full example, and honestly, much better example, of the same evidence from the earlier slide, but the writing is smoothed out. Note that I selectively quote my evidence and paraphrase the rest. This is a more advanced type of writing, but results in a smooth transition and overall flow. In short, I focus on the key phrases and writing which support the point I am making and paraphrase the rest. I suggest you try out this technique and see my other video on how to incorporate evidence for further details on how to do this, especially selective quoting. All right, back to our body paragraphs. Now that we have introduced an example, or more than one related examples, and our reader understands where it came from and in relation to the rest of the text, it's now time to explain it. This is our section that's known as commentary or reasoning. It depends what your teacher calls it. For this, you typically need to first interpret the example, but be careful that you don't just simply repeat the example in your own words. A lot of kids do that. It's really boring, it's redundant, and it's really just not good writing. Instead, start with how you know it is that writing choice. Explain how the writing choice functions, or explain the connotative meanings associated with the evidence. It all depends on what writing choices you pointed out and what point you're making. For my example, I picked description and contrasts of those descriptions. Note how in my commentary I requote keywords and phrases from what I already cited, but I'm also giving my spin on it and the way I interpret it. This is an easy way to engage with a specific explanation of the evidence. Here's another trick for more advanced writers. Did you know that sometimes we can also move on to another piece of evidence before giving our commentary and then follow up both pieces of evidence with commentary that ties them together? In my example before, I moved on from the explanation of the contrast into another example which adds to our understanding. I then spend some time explaining what all of that means and how it relates to my main point. You can also sometimes blend in commentary before a piece of evidence if you are a more advanced writer.
See your teacher if you're ready for that step, but go ahead and pause this and see how I'm able to blend these things together. So how do I transition between pieces of evidence? Okay, good question. To blend this with my previous sentence, I need a transition. There are several ways to do this, but first you need to think about the relationship between the pieces of evidence. Is the next one an additional piece of evidence of the same thing? In other words, is it kind of giving multiple receipts that add up to the conclusion you've reached? Or is it a contrasting idea that adds nuance to your interpretation, a different angle to look at it to show that what you're noticing actually has layers to it? Be sure you look up transitional phrases and words online for some ideas, and try not to just say things like, another example is, or another piece of evidence. Those can get really redundant. Also, you want to give the evidence some context if not done so already. So what's going on in this scene in relation to the previous example? Is it later in the plot? Is it 10 pages later? Is it at the end of the book? We need some of that to know what's going on. If you're analyzing a poem, is this several lines later? And are they even writing about the same concept or topic, or have they moved on? Those are all important things to think about. At my school, many of my students are familiar with a CER paragraph. Some call it a SIR paragraph. That stands for claim, evidence, and reasoning. However, I find that some students get stuck with very clunky writing, so I like to add a reminder about transitions between evidence. So these would be coming after your reasoning before you move on to your next piece of evidence. And then you continue this for however many pieces of evidence you need in that paragraph. How many pieces of evidence do you need? Talk to your teacher. What I tell my students is you need enough to prove your point and that you haven't left out any obvious ones I would expect someone to address in the argument that's being presented. Here it is, the final piece of evidence for my first body paragraph with its commentary or reasoning. It also wraps up the paragraph's focus on the tone and idea of innocence. Note the selective quoting with paraphrasing technique. Also note how it begins with a transition that couches this evidence in relation to the previous evidence. We can see that I am, in this case, adding more evidence that is similar in meaning and function as the previous evidence. More transitions, you bet. So, if you haven't already, you need to guide us from idea to idea with transitional words and phrases. So, closing out your paragraph with a transition to the next one. Now, some of you will do this at the end of one paragraph or at the beginning of the next one. It depends on your writing style. Make sure you check with your teacher about if you need to do both or one or the other. You're going to notice in my example on the previous slide, I worked it into my commentary at the end of my evidence. Here is the paragraph all put together and smoothed out. The yellow is my topic sentence. The blue is all my different pieces of context that I wove in. The green is my concrete evidence or examples. And the pink is my commentary or reasoning. Notice that the commentary, the pink stuff, is the largest portion. That is analysis at work. Most of your writing should be your interpretation and the connections you're making and all the meaning that you're pulling from the text that you're analyzing. So now I am ready to move on to my next body paragraph. Once we finish with our first body paragraph, it's time to move on to the next reason to support our argument or interpretation. In other words, it's time for body paragraph number 2. For my example essay, the next paragraph I'm writing about is focused on how the author's technique of dialogue and indirect characterization also support this idea of an illusion of innocence. Notice I don't always use those exact words in my example claim topic sentence, but you can tell it all relates. Again, use those synonyms. Use new ways to say the same thing you've said before. That's how you'll avoid being redundant. You'll also notice I don't say the second reason why, or my second point, or another writing choice. I just jump into the ideas and I transition to it. All right, so we just keep continuing the process of the previous body paragraph information, but with our new point and new evidence. Note that my example here includes a little bit of interpretation prior to the actual evidence. More advanced writers can get away with this, but make sure you check to see what your teacher prefers. There are some who like to see more formulaic completion prior to moving you to a more advanced technique or move like this. Sometimes the interpretation is blended with some context, and that's why this can work really well. The part of my statement that is interpretation is when I claim that he sounds much like an average child being put to bed with a nighttime story. The part of the sentence before that where I paraphrase the scene is my actual evidence. I then continue this evidence with the specific reference to scary stories. But note one citation because both the paraphrase and the quote are working together really as one piece of evidence. I then follow this up with more commentary about the evidence. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to see my example of my context sentence with evidence, and then also my other commentary and how I actually have multiple places where I have some interpretation or commentary. Here I've just taken that previous slide and put it into one section with all the color coding like you're used to. The yellow is my topic sentence. Once again, then I have my evidence with some context and interpretation and relevance. Notice I'm proving that the illusion works due to flattery, which all relates back to the idea of a mask of innocence. So go ahead and pause this if you need to read it all together and how it flows. You're going to notice that my pink isn't as much here. I actually did a lot of quoting here, and that's okay because I still have a lot of meaningful things that I'm saying in my commentary. Yes, the body paragraph continues with additional evidence about the boy. See what I added? Notice more context, selective quoting of the key writing choices which prove my point, and the analysis which ties everything together and calls out how the foreshadowing functions not just for the plot, but also in relation to the theme. And finally, here's that whole second body paragraph. If you want, read this and then go back and read body paragraph 1 and see how they're playing off of each other. It will give you an indication of how you should move through your own analysis essay. So what next? Keep writing body paragraphs. Continue it for however many more you need. Some teachers will give you a set number that you need for a paper. I usually tell students to have at least 3 body paragraphs, especially on a process essay. But especially with my honors kids, I tell them to have 4, 5, or even 6 body paragraphs. Again, follow your instructor's instructions or rubric to see what they're requiring from you. Another thing to think about, like I said earlier, how many examples should I have? That's what kids ask all the time. Again, it should be enough to solidly prove your points and show you analyzed the whole text and not just part of it. So when you're thinking about your body paragraphs, does it show that you analyzed the entire text? Or did you only analyze the first half of this text? That is key. If you haven't, you need to go back and add more body paragraphs to analyze more of that nuance. Thank you for watching this video about literary analysis body paragraphs. I have many other videos on my YouTube channel and resources in my Teachers Pay Teachers page. So go ahead and check them out for any more help you need.